They didn't believe us. 47 human colonies, gone. And when we stood before the Galactic Council and told them exactly what we were going to do about it, they laughed. That was their first mistake. And if you think you know how this ends, I'll promise you, you don't. Welcome to HFY Endurance Tales. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me, would you have shown mercy? Now, let's move forward into the silence between the stars and find out what happened when humanity stopped talking. The silence came first. Not the dramatic silence of alarms or battle, the worst kind. The kind where a signal just stops. A colony of 30,000 people on Kepler's reach, mid-transmission, mid-sentence, and then nothing. Static. Then the next one. Then the next. 47 colonies across 6 light-years of human frontier space. And every single one of them went dark inside of 8 months. Commander James Rourke had seen a lot of things in his 22 years with the United Earth Strategic Intelligence Division. He'd seen failed terraforming projects, rogue AI incidents, piracy on the outer belt runs. He had a file for almost everything, but he didn't have a file for this. He stood at the long table in the briefing room aboard the UESS Resolute, a man who looked exactly like what he was, someone who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. 43 years old, built like a man who'd spent his 20s doing things governments don't officially acknowledge, with the kind of quiet in his eyes that most people mistake for calm. It wasn't calm. It was discipline. There's a difference. The holographic display above the table showed the frontier map. 47 red markers, each one a name. Kepler's Reach, New Harrisburg, Fort Callaway, Dawson's Point. He knew some of them personally. He'd had a beer with the mayor of Dawson's Point 3 years ago during a routine inspection. Guy named Ted Morrow. 3 kids. Big laugh. Gone. We have confirmation, said Lieutenant Aaron Webb, his intelligence analyst, pulling up the latest satellite sweep. No debris fields consistent with natural disaster. No biological markers for plague. The infrastructure is intact. The people are gone. All of them. Rourke didn't say anything for a moment. He turned to the second display, where a repeating intercept was cycling. A fragmented communication snagged by a deep relay buoy near the Vreth corridor, the narrow stretch of traversable space between human territory and the Keth Dominion. The Keth were a coalition of 4 species operating under a single governing body, the Dominion Council. Politically ambitious, technologically capable, and for the last decade, increasingly aggressive about what they called unregistered resource extraction zones, which was their phrase for human-settled planets that sat on mineral-rich asteroid belts. The intercept was partial. 3 words translated clearly: relocation, cleansing, efficiency. Rourke stared at those 3 words for a long time. "Get me a channel to the Galactic Mediation Council," he said finally. Webb blinked. "Sir, the GMC hasn't meaningfully engaged with any human petition in—" "Get me the channel." He paused. "We're gonna do this right. Every step, every warning, every legal process. We are going to be so clean that when the history books are written, nobody gets to say we didn't try." Webb nodded slowly and got to work. What followed was 30 days of the most meticulous, documented diplomatic effort in human history. Rourke personally drafted the formal complaint, a full investigative request citing 17 different provisions of the Interstellar Accord that all spacefaring civilizations, including the Keth Dominion, had signed 60 years ago. It included coordinates, timestamps, population records, the intercepted transmission, and a request for an emergency joint investigation. The GMC acknowledged receipt. Then they sat on it for 29 days. On day 30, they issued a response. 3 paragraphs. The gist of it: insufficient evidence of Dominion involvement. Human colonies in the Vreth corridor had self-relocated before. The matter required standard review timelines of 18 to 24 months. Rourke read the response twice, folded his hands on the table, said nothing for a full minute. Then he picked up his secure comm and requested a direct audience before the full Galactic Mediation Council. Not a filing, not a petition, a live address. And he specified that he wanted it broadcast on the Open Galactic Relay Network, the channel every species with a receiver could access. They granted it, probably thinking it would be good theater. They had no idea what was coming. And neither did the woman sitting in the observation gallery of the GMC's orbital station, a Veth diplomatic analyst named Saris, whose bioluminescent skin pulsed soft amber in the recycled air, and whose 4 silver-irised eyes had spent the last week reading every piece of human historical documentation she could access. She was there as an independent observer from the Veth Collective, a neutral species who thus far managed to stay out of Dominion politics. She had read about human wars. She had read about human patience. She had, specifically, read about what happened when those two things ran out at the same time. She was the only one in that station who was genuinely afraid of what Rourke was going to say. She was right to be. The Galactic Mediation Council chamber was designed to make individuals feel small. That was the point. Soaring bioresin walls that glowed faintly blue, tiered seating for 42 species representatives, and at the center, a single raised podium where petitioners stood alone under directed light, surrounded by a ring of alien faces, ranging from politely indifferent to openly contemptuous. Commander James Rourke walked to that podium like he owned the floor beneath it. He wore his uniform. No medals, deliberately, he'd left them in his quarters. Just the uniform, clean and pressed, with the single emblem of the United Earth Strategic Intelligence Division on his left shoulder. He set a data chip on the podium edge. He looked around the chamber slowly, taking his time, letting the silence breathe. Then he spoke. "My name is Commander James Rourke. I represent the United Earth Government and the Strategic Command of the Human Frontier Systems. 47 of our colonies are gone. Approximately 1.2 million of our people, men, women, children, have vanished from their homes in a pattern that is not accidental, not natural, and not ambiguous." He let that sit. "We filed a formal complaint 30 days ago. We received a response that was, to be direct, an insult dressed up in administrative language. So I'm here today not to file another complaint." He picked up the data chip, held it up briefly, and set it back down. "I'm here to deliver a warning. One warning. Formal, recorded, and transmitted across the Open Galactic Relay Network, so that every species and governing body in range understands what I am saying and cannot later claim ignorance." The Kef Dominion's senior representative, a heavyset being called Counselor Drav, with thick ridged armor plating across his shoulders, and a voice modulator that made him sound like a landslide, leaned forward. "Commander, this body does not respond to ultimatums from—" "You'll want to let me finish," Rourke said. Not loud, not hostile, completely flat. Drav stopped. "The United Earth Government is formally notifying this council and the Keth Dominion that we have identified your involvement in the disappearance of our people. We have evidence. We will not be releasing that evidence in this chamber today, because we have no reason to trust this chamber." He paused. "We are giving the Dominion 30 days to return our people, however many are still alive, to a neutral handoff point of our designation. We are giving this council 30 days to open a genuine joint, independent investigation with unrestricted access." He straightened slightly. "If those conditions are not met, if in 30 days we have not received proof of life and the beginning of a transparent process, the United Earth Government will consider itself in a state of active defense, and we will act accordingly." Counselor Drav laughed. It was a wet, grinding sound. Several other representatives joined in. The chamber filled with the noise of 42 species, finding this very funny. Active defense, Drav said, when he could manage it. Commander, do you have any concept of the combined military capability of the Dominion? Your frontier fleet consists of, what, 11 warships? 14? You would act accordingly? More laughter. Please, tell us more. Rourke didn't smile, didn't move. That warning is now logged, time-stamped, and broadcast. The 30 days begin now. He picked up his data chip. Thank you for your time. He walked out. In the observation gallery, Ceres sat very still, her bioluminescence cycling through a rapid amber to white pulse that in Veth physiology indicated a very specific emotional state. Her colleague leaned over and asked her what was wrong. He didn't argue, she said quietly. He didn't defend. He didn't negotiate. So? Humans argue when they're afraid, Ceres said. He wasn't afraid. Her colleague found that amusing. Ceres did not. Back aboard the Resolute, Rourke sealed himself in his private office. He sat down. He pulled out a worn photograph, actual printed paper, which was practically antique, of a woman and 2 kids in front of a red-roofed house somewhere sunny. He set it on the desk facing him. His sister and her family. They lived on New Harrisburg. Gone. Then he opened his tactical terminal and began issuing orders that had been drafted, revised, rehearsed, and refined over the past 3 months. Orders that had nothing to do with the speech he'd just given. The speech was the warning. The orders were the preparation. And at a dozen different coordinates across human space, things began to move. Ships that had been running silent in deep system shadows. Supply caches that had been staged and restaged 6 times to avoid detection. Intelligence assets embedded so deeply in Dominion logistics networks that they'd been feeding data for over a year. The galaxy had been watching James Rourke deliver a speech. It hadn't been watching anything else. Day 29 of the 30-day window. A Dominion press release declared the matter resolved through internal review, and recommended that humanity accept the natural challenges of frontier settlement. No acknowledgement. 1 day ahead of the deadline, Rourke received a private communication from Ceres, routed through 3 relay jumps and flagged as personal correspondence, nothing that would raise Dominion attention. It said, I need to speak with you. What I found in the Dominion's restricted records, Commander, they didn't just take your people. There are processing facilities. I have coordinates. Rourke read the message twice. He typed back 3 words. 30 hours. Come. Then he looked at the photograph on his desk and felt something cold and very focused settle into the center of his chest. The clock hit 0. Ceres came aboard the Resolute through a cargo lock at 0300 hours, disguised in a Veth Trade Consortium uniform, traveling on a merchant transit pass that Rourke's intelligence team had quietly arranged. She was taller than Rourke had expected, close to 6.5 feet, with that soft amber bioluminescence shifting across her skin like slow firelight, and 4 eyes that tracked everything in the room independently. She moved with the precise, considered efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where a wrong word ended careers. She set a data drive on the table without preamble. These are Dominion internal logistics manifests from their Vreth Corridor Command Network, she said. I accessed them through a research sharing agreement between the Veth Collective and the Dominion Science Directorate. I was not supposed to access this directory. I am aware of the risk. Why? Her 4 eyes settled on him in a way that felt like being examined from multiple angles simultaneously. Because what they did to your people was not war. It was not policy. It was efficient disposal. And the Dominion is currently proposing the same relocation protocol for 3 Veth settlement zones that overlap with their new expansion corridor. She said it without drama, just facts. They're going to do it to your people next, Rourke said. In approximately 2 years, based on their projected timeline, yes. Rourke plugged the drive in, What came up on the display made Webb, standing to the side, physically step back. Processing stations, coded as resource extraction infrastructure, staffed with Dominion logistics personnel, and in the intake records, human identification codes, names, ages, designations. Ted Morrow, Dawson's Point, registered Facility 7. Rourke stared at that line for 3 seconds. Then, he forwarded the entire dataset to the secure archive that had been transmitting continuously to 17 different neutral species legal repositories since the day he'd left the council chamber. An insurance policy. How many are still alive? He asked. Facility records show approximately 340,000 registered humans still in processing status as of 6 weeks ago, Sarah said. The Dominion uses the term pending assignment. I don't know what that means in practice. It means they're still deciding what to do with them, Webb said, voice tight. Rourke stood up. Then we have a window. He pulled up the strategic display. 7 Dominion processing facilities identified, all within a cluster in the Vreth corridor. Logistically smart positioning on their part, geographically tight from a strike perspective. Also the reason his pre-positioned assets had been parked exactly where they were for the last 3 months. What you did getting this data, that wasn't neutral party behavior. No, she agreed, it wasn't. You're at risk going back. Also yes. He nodded once, accepting that with respect, rather than making it a problem to solve for her. Then stay. We'll need a witness with legal standing when this is over. Someone who can testify to what the records show. She considered that for exactly 2 seconds. Yes, acceptable. Also, he added, with the barest hint of something dry in his tone, you might want to be somewhere else when the next part starts. What is the next part? Rourke turned to his tactical display and began issuing the order sequence. Each command unlocked a layer. It was like watching a set of gears begin to turn, slow and inevitable. 11 warships, he said, almost to himself, echoing Drav's mockery from the council chamber. He allowed himself one small, humorless smile. He wasn't wrong about the 11 warships. He pulled up the full strategic map. Beyond the 11 ships of the official human frontier fleet, 43 additional vessels were now breaking cover from their holding positions. Retrofitted freighters with military-grade hulls, deep survey ships carrying ordnance loads that deep survey ships absolutely were not supposed to carry, and 6 brand-new vessels that had been built in classified shipyards and listed in Earth's budget under infrastructure development. Webb let out a low breath. All green. Broadcast the final notification to the Dominion Council, Rourke said. Standard diplomatic channels. I want it received and logged before anything moves. The notification was 5 sentences. The 30-day deadline has passed. No conditions were met. The United Earth government is now operating in active defense status. Evacuation corridors for Dominion civilian vessels are designated at coordinates attached. Use them. He wasn't bluffing about the evacuation corridors. That was the part no one expected. In the Dominion Command Center in the Vreth corridor, the notification arrived while Admiral Kress, the Dominion's theater commander, was being briefed on the 11-ship human fleet he expected to be dealing with. He read the notification. He read it again. He was about to dismiss it when his sensor officer's voice cracked across the room. Admiral, contacts, multiple contacts, Vreth corridor approach, bearing. The officer stopped, recounted. 54 contacts, Admiral. Human configuration. Armed. The silence in that command center lasted about 4 full seconds. Kress grabbed his comm. Battle stations. But then something strange happened. The 54 human ships didn't advance. They held position, every single one of them, in a line across the corridor like a wall. And then every Dominion sensor array simultaneously registered a pulse. Not a weapon, a signal, broadcasting on the open galactic relay network. Playing Rourke's address from 30 days ago, word for word, one warning, 30 days. followed by the Dominion's press release declaring the matter resolved, followed by Ceres's logistics files, all of it, to every receiver in range. In the GMC chamber, the representatives watched their displays fill with data. The laughter from a month ago was very quiet now. Ceres sat in the Resolute's observation bay, watching the Vreth corridor on the tactical feed, her bioluminescence cycling white. That for something like awe, or the beginning of understanding something you'd missed entirely. You weren't delivering a warning, she said quietly to the empty room. You were building a record. She was correct. And before anyone in the galaxy could fully process what was happening, Rourke's voice came over the ship-wide comm. All units, execute. The first thing humanity did was not attack. That was the thing the Dominion hadn't prepared for. The 54 human ships held the Vreth corridor, forming what would later be called the Line, a deliberate, unmistakable defensive posture that gave any Dominion civilian vessel a clear, unobstructed path to the designated evacuation corridors Rourke had specified in the notification. 3 Dominion cargo haulers took those corridors immediately. 6 more followed within 20 minutes. Kress watched his own people retreat through the gap humanity had opened for them, and felt something he didn't have a word for. It wasn't gratitude, it was something more unsettling. That the enemy you're about to fight is operating on an entirely different moral frequency than you expected. He ordered his fleet, 40 warships, into a formation. What he didn't know was that the 54 ships visible on his sensors were the distraction. Rourke stood at the tactical station on the Resolute's bridge, watching 3 separate feeds simultaneously. The line was holding. The Dominion fleet was moving into engagement formation, and on the 3rd feed, 6 small vessels that had been running silent and cold for 11 days were now making their final approach to Facility 7. The facilities sat on a moon in the shadow of a gas giant. Smart positioning, minimal sensor exposure. It had no heavy weapons. Why would it? It processed civilians. It had a perimeter drone screen and a garrison of about 300 Dominion ground troops. It had never once considered that anyone would come for the people inside. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, Aaron's older brother, which was not a coincidence, because Rourke had learned long ago that the people you want on a rescue mission are the ones with something personal on the line, led the 6-ship assault team. They came in low, skimming the gas giant's upper atmosphere, using the magnetic interference as cover until they were inside the drone screen's detection threshold. Then they moved fast. The garrison's response time was 11 minutes, which was, by military standards, not terrible. By the time they reached the facility's outer ring, however, humanity's special operations teams had already breached 3 entry points and were inside. What they found, what Marcus Webb saw when he went through the first interior door, was one of those moments that burns itself into a person permanently. Rows, hundreds of rows of temporary housing cells, each one holding human beings in various states of frightened, exhausted, surviving. People who'd been taken from their beds on Kepler's Reach, from their dinner tables on Fort Calloway, from their front yards on New Harrisburg, alive. "Usid, identify yourself and move toward the marked exits." Webb's voice carried the specific tone that soldiers use when they are simultaneously devastated and burning with purpose. "We are United Earth. We are taking you home." The response from inside those cells, a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a roar, was the kind of thing that stays with a person. Meanwhile, in the Vreth corridor, Kress launched his fleet. 40 Dominion warships against 54 human vessels. On paper, not unreasonable. The Dominion ships were larger, individually more powerful, and their weapons range was superior. Every tactical model in the Dominion's database predicted a difficult but achievable engagement. The human ships were smaller, fast, but surely outgunned. What the models hadn't accounted for was that the human fleet's positioning wasn't designed for a direct fight. It was designed for a funnel. The Vreth corridor was exactly what its name implied: narrow. 2 effective approach lanes, both of which the human line bracketed. When the Dominion fleet advanced, they had to compress their formation, which was exactly what Rourke wanted. 40 large ships, suddenly operating in a space designed for 20. Their overlapping sensor fields creating interference. Their weapon arcs partially blocked by their own allies. Human ships hit the flanks first, not targeting weapons systems, not targeting engines, targeting communications arrays. Ship after ship going tactically deaf, unable to coordinate. Kress issuing orders that a third of his fleet simply couldn't receive. "They're not trying to kill us," one of Kress's bridge officers said, with the confused tone of someone whose tactical model just stopped making sense. "They're isolating us." Rourke's voice came through on an open hail to the Dominion fleet. "Admiral Kress, you have 17 ships that can still break formation and use evacuation corridor Delta. I'm giving you 3 minutes to make that decision." Kress did not respond. He ordered a full weapon salvo on the human center line, 3 of them severe enough to require emergency maneuvering. 2 human crew members died in those first minutes, names that Rourke would add to a list he was keeping in a document marked "cost," because the decision to go to war had a cost, and he refused to forget that for even 1 second. Then the return fire came. Not from the 54. From 6 positions behind the Dominion fleet, pre-staged human units that had been parked in deep shadow at the far end of the corridor, waiting. The crossfire wasn't designed to destroy. It was designed to force Kress's fleet to split attention in both directions, to keep them in the funnel, to deny them the option of reorganizing. Pinned, confused, unable to communicate effectively with a third of their own ships. On the ground inside Facility 7, Marcus Webb was moving his evacuees toward the landing zone, when the garrison finally organized a meaningful response. 3 squads, coming from the north perimeter, trained soldiers, covering fire, moving professionally. Webb's team was outnumbered at the facility point. He made the call that felt wrong and was right. He called for extraction on the first group of civilians, 700 people, the ones physically capable of moving fastest, and ordered his rear team to hold position. Buy time. 6 soldiers against 3 squads. His rear team didn't ask questions. They dug in. The first extraction shuttle lifted. 200 meters above the facility, it transmitted a coded signal. In the Vreth corridor, Rourke received it. He allowed himself 1 single breath. Then Admiral Kress, whose fleet was fractured and burning and blind in 3 sections, received a direct communication from the Dominion Council itself. High Command, overriding his tactical command. It said, "Stand down. New orders incoming." Kress stared at the message. It had the right authentication codes, the right command signature. He lowered his weapons, which was the exact moment Rourke stopped holding his breath and started moving. Because the communication to Kress hadn't come from the Dominion Council. It had come from a human signals intelligence team that had spent 14 months cracking Dominion command encryption. And in 7 minutes, before Kress figured that out, every human ship still capable of movement was about to execute the second half of the operation. 7 minutes. That was all Rourke needed. 7 minutes of the Dominion fleet standing down, confused, waiting for orders that made sense, to move the pieces that mattered. The rescue shuttles hit their marks across all 7 facilities simultaneously. The coordination was the kind of thing that should not have been possible. 7 different moons, 7 garrison forces, 7 separate extraction timelines. And it had been rehearsed in simulation 340 times over 4 months. Adjusted each time, tightened, until it was as close to perfect as human beings could engineer it. Rourke had never believed in perfect. He believed in prepared. In the Vreth corridor, Kress figured out the deception in 5 minutes, not 7. He was a capable commander, which Rourke had accounted for. The operation didn't require the full 7 minutes. It required 4. And by the time Cress came back online, and furious, 212,000 human survivors were either loaded or actively boarding extraction vessels. The remaining 128,000 were in facilities that the extraction teams hadn't reached yet. Rourke made the decision that no version of himself had ever wanted to make. He ordered the extraction teams for those facilities to hold position, keep the garrison forces occupied, prevent any harm to the survivors, and bought time the only way left available. He moved the Resolute itself forward into the corridor, positioned it between the recovering Dominion fleet and the still active extraction sites, and opened a direct hail to Cress. "Admiral." His voice was calm. "Your fleet is damaged. Your command network is compromised, and you have 212,000 of my people already clear of your territory. You have 3 choices. Continue fighting. I will damage you further and still extract everyone. Stand down completely and agree to a ceasefire. We finish the extraction, nobody else gets hurt. Or," he paused, "you can make me come through you, in which case I want you to understand that I will, and that I find no satisfaction in any casualty on either side, but I will." Cress said nothing for a long moment. Rourke could hear faintly the sound of Cress's bridge, officers reporting in, damage assessments, the noise of a command center trying to recover from chaos. Then Cress said, "You planned this for months." "Yes. You knew we would ignore the deadline. I hoped you wouldn't. I prepared for the likelihood that you would." Another pause. "You built evacuation corridors into your assault plan. For our civilians." "Yes. Why?" Rourke thought of Ted Morrow. 3 kids, big laugh. "Because my people didn't deserve what happened to them. That doesn't mean yours do either." The silence stretched. Saris, watching from the Resolute's observation bay, had gone completely still, her bioluminescence steady white. Cress said, "Ceasefire. I need confirmation that my garrison troops will not be targeted during extraction completion." "Confirmed. They stand down. They're not touched." "Agreed." It took 40 more minutes. Every minute was its own small nightmare of tense communication, potential misunderstanding, trigger-finger decisions by people on both sides who had been in an active firefight and didn't entirely trust a ceasefire that had appeared out of nowhere. Through professionalism on both sides, through Webb's rear team maintaining absolute fire discipline, through Rourke staying on the open hail with Cress for the entire 40 minutes, talking when necessary, silent when better. It held. The last extraction shuttle lifted from Facility 3 at 1847 hours. Total recovered, 338,400 survivors. Of the estimated 1.2 million originally displaced, 860,000 were unaccounted for. The ones who had been processed through facilities already emptied, records destroyed. That truth landed on Rourke like a weight he was going to carry for the rest of his life. He recovered who he could. He would spend years finding out what happened to the rest. But 338,400 people were alive, who should have been erased. Rourke sat down in his command chair, for the first time in what felt like days, and looked at the tactical feed as the Dominion fleet held position and the human ships formed up around the extraction convoy. Webb's voice came over comms from the last shuttle. "Commander, good copy on extraction complete. Sir." A pause. "Ted Morrow sends his regards." Rourke closed his eyes for about 3 seconds. When he opened them, they were dry and focused and ready for what came next. Because the war wasn't over yet. The Dominion Council was going to spin this. Cress's ceasefire was tactical, not political. And the GMC, whose chamber had been watching everything broadcast on the open relay network, was going to have to decide what it was made of. Rourke picked up his comm and opened a channel to every neutral species receiver in range. "This is Commander James Rourke, United Earth's Strategic Intelligence Division. The Keth Dominion has agreed to an operational ceasefire. I am formally requesting an emergency session of the Galactic Mediation Council for the purpose of—" His comms officer cut in. "Sir, GMC is already broadcasting. They've called the session themselves." Rourke blinked. "Voluntarily?" "Yes, sir. Mandatory. All species. Full tribunal authority." He looked at the display. 42 species representatives requesting confirmation of attendance. He leaned back in his chair and felt something that wasn't victory yet. Victory would come later, but was the first honest breath he'd taken in months. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's finish it." The Galactic Mediation Council's Emergency Tribunal convened 17 days after the Vreth Corridor ceasefire. It met not in the usual GMC orbital station. That chamber had been quietly agreed to be too compromised by what had happened there, but aboard a Veth collective diplomatic vessel, chosen because the Veth were the only major species everyone trusted to be actually neutral. Saris had something to do with that decision, though she presented it through channels that made it look like everyone's idea. She had a talent for that. The proceedings lasted 9 days. Rourke testified for 6 hours. The Dominion's senior counselor Drav, who had laughed, sat through every hour of it with the expression of someone processing something that had fundamentally rearranged their worldview. The Dominion's position shifted rapidly once the logistics manifests were entered as formal evidence. By day 3, they'd dismissed 2 council members pending individual charges. By day 6, they were cooperating with the tribunal's investigative team. Not because they wanted to, because the alternative was losing the Dominion Council's recognition by every other species in the network. Economic death, diplomatic death, the kind of isolation that collapses governments over years. The galaxy had watched what happened in the Vreth Corridor on open relay. Every species with a receiver. And what they'd seen wasn't a human military rampage. What they'd seen was a rescue operation. A documented, warned, precisely executed rescue operation, with evacuation corridors for enemy civilians, and a ceasefire offered at the first possible moment. The galaxy had been afraid of humans in the abstract. Now they were afraid of humans in a very specific, much more unsettling way. The kind of fear you feel for people who are competent, restrained, and out of patience in equal measure. A dozen species ambassadors quietly requested bilateral meetings with the United Earth government within the first week. Not because humanity had demanded it, because they'd done the math. The final tribunal resolution, signed on the 9th day, established 3 things. First, formal recognition of Dominion responsibility for the displacement and deaths of human colonial populations. Second, the establishment of the Frontier Settlement Protection Accord, a legally binding framework with actual enforcement mechanisms covering all colonial territories in the Vreth Corridor and adjacent space. Third, an independent joint commission to locate and account for every human colonist displaced in the operation, alive or otherwise. Rourke read the resolution in a quiet room aboard the Resolute, alone. He read it twice. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the weight of the 860,000 names that still didn't have answers. He felt the weight of 2 human crew members who died in the corridor engagement. He kept those names in the cost document. He wasn't going to close that file. But 338,400 people were going home. Ted Morrow had already been transported to a medical facility on Kepler Station. His kids had been in the second extraction wave. They'd been at a different facility, which was information nobody had known going in, and which had nearly broken web when he found out. But they were there, alive. Rourke got a brief message through official channels. "Thanks for not giving up on us, Commander." Ted. He didn't know what to say that was proportionate to the situation. He saved the message. On the 10th day after the tribunal resolution, Saris formally submitted her testimony to the Veth Collective's governmental record. It was the kind of document that becomes a legal precedent. the kind that people cite for decades. In it, she described in precise, clinical, Veth characteristic terms what she had observed: the warning, the deadline, the Dominion's response, the evidence she'd uncovered, and the human response. All of it. The final paragraph was different from the rest. It was the only part of the document that didn't read like legal testimony. It read like something she'd had to write 3 times before she got it right. She submitted it anyway. At the tribunal's formal closing ceremony, broadcast again on the open galactic relay network, because Rourke had made sure everything was on the record, always. Sarah stood at the speaker's position and delivered her testimony summary aloud, as required. Her bioluminescence was steady amber, which Rourke had learned meant something like composure being maintained with effort. She summarized the evidence. She summarized the timeline. And then she looked out at the assembled representatives of 42 species and said, "I have spent the last several weeks reviewing human history in detail. It is not a comfortable history. It is complicated and sometimes brutal, and humans themselves would be the first to tell you that. But there is a pattern in it that I did not understand until I watched Commander Rourke walk out of this council's chamber 31 days before his fleet moved. Humans are remarkably patient, up to a specific point. They extend that patience further than most species would. They document, they warn, they offer options." She paused. "And when those options are refused, they do not bluster or escalate by degrees. They respond with everything they prepared, and they do not stop until the situation is resolved." She looked at the Dominion section of the chamber. "Commander Rourke warned this council. He warned the Dominion. He gave specific terms, a specific deadline, and a specific record of every offer of resolution that was refused. This tribunal exists because those warnings were ignored." Another pause. "They told you what they were going to do. They told you when. They told you why. And when you laughed, her 4 silver eyes moved across the chamber slowly. They did exactly what they said." The chamber was very quiet. Saris looked directly at the visual relay transmitter, at every receiver across every system tuned in. "Humanity did warn them," she said. "The record is clear. The warning was real. They were not boasting. They were not performing. They were telling you the truth." She let the silence stretch for 1 beat. They always were. The tribunal closed. The accord was signed. The first joint commission ship departed for the Vreth corridor that same afternoon, carrying investigators from 9 different species. Rourke stood at the docking bay of the Resolute, as the ship prepared to return to frontier space. There was work ahead. The commission, the rebuilding of the colonies, the long, unglamorous work of finding answers for 860,000 missing names. The kind of work that doesn't make for great broadcasts, but is the real work, the necessary work, the work that earns the right to call what happened in the Vreth corridor a beginning rather than an ending. Webb appeared next to him. "Orders, sir?" Rourke watched the stars through the bay's viewport. The same stars, a different galaxy than the one they started in ways that mattered. "Same as before," he said. "Do it right, every step." He picked up his bag and walked toward the ship. He didn't look back at the tribunal station. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. There was only forward. He had 860,000 reasons to keep moving. That's the story, everyone. And if this got under your skin the way I think it did, if you felt something when those shuttles lifted, when Saris said those words, when Rourke walked back to his ship, then you know what to do. Leave a comment below. Would you have given them the 30 days? Or would you have moved sooner? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, welcome to HFY Endurance Tales. Subscribe, because this is just the beginning. The galaxy has more stories to answer for. We'll be here.